Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20664 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Minister Graham Day to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. I call Gillian Mackay.
Presiding Officer, I want to be clear that the Greens will not oppose the business motion, but I did want to raise the late notice of changes and the impact more widely in the Chamber. Over the last few weeks, we've had a series of very late decision times impacting those of us with caring responsibilities or with other responsibilities at home. I hope that as we go through the rest of this session, we will remember that we need to take these decisions in a timely manner and the impact that late changes have on everybody across the Chamber.
I call the Minister.
Officer, on behalf of the Bureau, can I say to Gillian Mackay that her concerns are noted. I hope, as a former business manager herself, she'll appreciate that we had to balance a number of asks and pressures in coming to the schedule of business that we've arrived at, and some of those arose quite late in the day. We have to consider, as I say, a number of pressures when it comes to scheduling business, and people's childcare and responsibilities, particularly when it comes to extended sittings, are always something we consider if we're cited on them, of course. But she has given us something else to think about in terms of moving business within established timings as well, and I'm sure that's something the Bureau will reflect upon.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that Business Motion 20664 be agreed. Is the Parliament agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. So we will move on to the next item of business. The next item of business is topical questions. And at question number 1, I call Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the recent announcement that the total projected cost for MV Glen Rosa has risen by £12.5 million to £197.5 million, whether it will confirm how much further public funding will be required before the vessel enters service.
Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes.
Last week, the Chief Executive of Ferguson Marine advised the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee that the estimated cost to finish building Glen Rosa had increased by £7 million. And to account for potential risks, the business has allocated an additional £5.5 million of contingency, resulting in a total forecast cost to complete of £197.5 million. In line with normal practice, the Government is carefully assessing the information provided to understand the full implications of the revised timetable and costs. Whilst I understand that the final stages of building and testing a complex vessel are highly technical, and some risks only become clear at this point in the process, the further delay and increased costs are still extremely disappointing, particularly for island communities which rely on these services. Ferguson's plan to hand over the vessel in Q4, and we would expect it to enter service 6 weeks after handover.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you. The Deputy First Minister for that answer. On the 13th of May last year, Graham Thompson and the Deputy First Minister both individually wrote to the Net Zero Committee. Graham said he was comfortable with the new plan and the revised costings for the Glen Rosa. The Deputy First Minister stated the Government's expectation was that the senior leadership of Ferguson Marine must demonstrate capability and accountability for the delivery of Glen Rosa. Now that there is a further increase on £12.5 million, not 7.5, there was a contingency sum in there which was hopefully never going to be spent. Does the Government have any confidence in the board at Ferguson Marine and the new Chief Executive?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, in terms of both the board and the Chief Executive, I do have great confidence in them. As the member will know, Graham Thompson was newly in the door at that point. I think by the 13th of May, which is the date that Edward Mountain cites, he'd been in the job for about 13 days. And we have also very recently appointed a new chair. And both of them, between them, probably have more experience of shipbuilding than any of their predecessors. So I do have confidence, and that doesn't take away in any way from how regrettable this latest change is.
Edward Mountain.
Well, let's be clear. The CEO, when he moved in, delayed reporting to the Net Zero Committee so he could find out the facts on the ground. And he delayed that report and wrote that letter when he did. So now we're going to end up, Deputy First Minister, with a ferry worth £55 million, which has cost us £197.5 million. If she has confidence in the board, whilst the rest of Scotland doesn't, then surely she should resign from overseeing Ferguson Marine, because she has been ignored and her position has been totally undermined.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, the member will recall that there's only about 2 months left before I will no longer be in this place. So on that point, in terms of the Chief Executive and the board, off the back of the changes in earlier last year, we put in place a new structure in order to query, to challenge and to scrutinise the figures. Now, that is working well, and there have been issues that have been identified late on in the process. We appreciate that that is far, far from ideal, but the figures that have been put to the committee are being challenged by the Scottish Government in terms of the accuracy of those figures and the expectation that the board and the Chief Executive, both of whom have signed off on these most recent budget forecasts, will be held to account for the forecasts that they have provided to the committee.
I call Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With the new structure referenced by the Deputy First Minister, can the Deputy First Minister provide reassurance that the Scottish Government is continuing to seek both social and also economic best value in delivering vessels with Ferguson Marine?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, my top priority has been the completion of the Glen Rosa, so that we are able to improve the lifeline services for our island communities with a more sustainable and better quality service. That is a service that our island communities deserve, and having spent considerable time to complete the Glen Rosa, it's my firm view that it must be completed as quickly as possible. I also agree with Stuart McMillan, who has worked tirelessly to represent his constituents who work at Ferguson Marine and the wider community in Inverclyde, that we will continue to support the talented and dedicated workforce at the yard and to ensure the best value for those who are relying on the vessels.
And I call Katie Clark.
Thank you. And does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that this is yet another failure by management at Ferguson Marine rather than the workforce? And can she say more in her role as Finance Secretary as to what is being done to provide support to those who are suffering as a result of this, islanders on Arran and the community in Ardrossan, and what financial support she's putting in place?
Deputy First Minister.
Just a point of information that I'm no longer the Finance Secretary, which is probably relevant to that question. And in terms of her first point, she talks about the difference between management. I think the point she's trying to make is the question around the workforce and the talent of the workforce. And I absolutely agree with her in full that the talent, the ability and the skills of the workforce have never been in any doubt. And in the most recent tenders for new work, the feedback that has been received has pointed to the quality of the work and the need to build on that reputationally in order to secure new work.
Thank you. I call question number 2, Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I remind the Chamber of my declaration of interest. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reported concerns that pupils, parents and teachers may have to wait until 2031 for meaningful reform of the qualifications system, and the Qualifications Scotland will only be a rebrand of the Scottish Qualification Authority, with many of the same structures and staff remaining in place.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
Yesterday's launch of Qualifications Scotland and the recent announcement of the appointment of Ruth Binks to the role of Chief Inspector are major milestones in re-establishing trust and confidence in the system following the passing of the Education Scotland Act 2025. The new Qualifications Scotland Board had an overhauled governance structure with recruitment to learner and teacher interest committees already underway. They will guide the school partnership team, led by Sarah Brown, an experienced head teacher, to ensure Qualifications Scotland is shaped by the learners and practitioners it serves. Change is already underway on rebalancing assessment methods, placing less reliance on high-stakes examinations, and work is progressing well on the curriculum improvement cycle, ensuring that curriculum change drives qualifications reform in a systematic way in the coming years.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for that response. And she talks about re-establishing the trust following the 2025 Act. But of course, it's children currently in Primary 4 who will sit the new rebalanced assessments in 2031. It was in 2013 this government said Scotland would be the best place in the world for a child to grow up. Why has it taken so long to reach this point? And can the Cabinet Secretary give families a clear assurance that the system pupils will face in 2031 will be fairer and more reflective of their ability than the one it's replacing?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Mr Whitfield for his question. I do think there's somewhat a little conflation in relation to the published timeline in terms of qualification update, which I published back in June 2025. So the detail the member is talking to is not necessarily new. What happened yesterday, of course, was the official stepping up of Qualifications Scotland. And it is worthwhile again recording on the record today, Presiding Officer, that much of the work is already underway in relation to qualifications reform. So as part of the work on rebalancing assessment methods, which the Government has accepted and thinks is important, we are placing less reliance on high-stakes examinations, so written examinations from practical catecraft, metalworking and woodworking and National 5 have already been removed. This work will be extended with stakeholder engagement on the removal of exams underway for a further 3 practical subjects set to roll out in 26-27. And in terms of qualification design, the new product type design phase started in autumn of last year with subject level development from 28, with the aim of new levels 4 and 5 qualifications aligned to the curriculum framework from 2031. But I think it is important in the broadest terms, Presiding Officer, to accept that changes are already coming, and in relation to the member's point, curriculum improvement in its totality is going to look across the board, not just at senior phase, but right from the early years all the way through our curriculum to ensure it's fit for purpose and updated accordingly.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful for that response, and the Cabinet Secretary talks about the rebalance that sits at the heart of this. So, can the Scottish Government say how many additional teachers or specialist staff will be in place to deliver these reforms, and by when? And if the Cabinet Secretary cannot answer that, does she accept that without this extra capacity, this risks increasing teacher workload and undermining fairness for pupils?
Cabinet Secretary.
I very much agree with the member's point in relation to teacher workload. It's exactly why I've taken a pragmatic approach to the delivery of qualification reform, because I, like Mr Whitfield, was in a classroom before I was in this place, and I know that qualification reform the last time around at times felt as though it might have been dealt with in a better way. So I've reflected on that as Cabinet Secretary. And I think it is important we work with the profession. And as the member knows, of course, the profession at the current time are balloting in relation to strike action on workload. I don't think as Cabinet Secretary it would be in my best interest to rush forward qualification reform without listening to those concerns and working with the profession. So I'll continue to engage with the profession to that end. The member asked a substantial question in relation to specialist staff. I haven't been given advice to that end yet from Qualifications Scotland, but I will continue to engage with them. I'm more than happy to meet with the member or to send him further written detail in relation to that specific point.
Supplementary, Stephen Kerr.
Well, the last thing that we could accuse the Cabinet Secretary of is rushing forward with anything. We warned the Cabinet Secretary at the time of the passage of the Act last year that Qualifications Scotland was simply going to be a renaming, a replating on the door, a rebranding of education of the SQA. And we warned the Cabinet Secretary at the time that what was needed was culture change. But not just us. I mean, we were simply quoting the OECD, Morgan, Muir, Hayward, the National Discussion Document, all of these reviews and reports that cost a fortune to conduct, all of which concluded that we needed urgency and we needed reform. And as Martin Whitfield says, the children that are currently in primary school will not see any change.
Mr Kerr, please resume your seat for a second. I was speaking. Please resume your seat for a second. I asked you, because you're over your time, if you could please pose a question. Could you please resume and pose a question? Thank you.
I'm not aware that I have a time, and I was trying to finish
You have around 45 seconds.
When you interrupted.
Around 45 seconds, Mr Kerr.
So I will...
Please ask your question.
I'm simply making the point we will see no change in the lifetime of the next Parliament. So how can the Cabinet Secretary be satisfied with such inertia when she knows that change is urgently required?
Cabinet Secretary, and the Cabinet Secretary, where she has around a minute to respond. Thank you.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I'm well used to Mr Kerr's warnings, and of course I always listen to the advice he provides me, which is exactly why in relation to qualifications reform I was really keen that we had a schools unit with a designated secondary head teacher working with the profession for all the good reasons that Mr Kerr has set out in relation to culture change. I accept the points he makes in relation to the reports, but I do not need him to recount reports to me because I was in a school before I was in this place, and I know that we need to do better in relation to engaging with the profession, which is exactly why Sarah Brown has come out of a school to lead on that important work, alongside a plethora of other classroom teachers who are qualified to deliver that work and to improve the communication and the culture that Mr Kerr spoke to as well.
Supplementary, Willie Rennie.
It has taken too long, but I am pleased the SQA was scrapped and replaced by Qualifications Scotland. But indeed my concern is pace, because we are 10 years on from the big promise to reform Scottish education, and we've seen hardly any improvement in that time. But the real issue here is partnership. How can we make sure that the new qualifications body works with the rest of the education system, because they were seen as intransigent and slow in the past? What has the Cabinet Secretary done to improve that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie for his question and, of course, for his support of the successful passage of the bill. I think we should be mindful in relation to the points we've talked about today that Qualifications Scotland does not sit on its own in a silo. It requires to work with other bodies, as Mr Rennie has rightly pointed to, Education Scotland, but also the Centre for Teaching Excellence. And I would encourage Mr Rennie, if he has time between now and the end of March, to go to Glasgow, as I did last week, to meet with the teachers who have been seconded into the centre, who speak with passion about the opportunities it is giving them in relation to CPD opportunities. More broadly, in terms of how these organisations work together, the member will be aware of the work we are leading on education reform, which also links to Mr Macpherson's responsibilities in this area. So we have a board that overlooks these bodies in their totality, and I'd be more than happy to set out a bit more of that in detail to the member, as I am conscious of time today, but to give him that assurance that there is that oversight in relation to qualifications reform, but across the education portfolio, not just limited to schools and qualifications.
And supplementary, Fulton McGregor.
Presiding Officer, exam results for 2025 saw attainment rise across the board and an increase in the number of students achieving passes at all qualification levels. Can I therefore ask how the Government is working to ensure that any reform that does take place to the qualification system continues to support these successes of Scotland's learners?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member presiding officer for highlighting the achievements of our young people today. A record number of vocational and technical qualifications were achieved in 2025. And we know that pass rates for National 4, 5, Higher and Advanced Higher were up compared to 2024. We are making very important changes to our curriculum, qualifications and assessment system, but the reforms have to protect and build on the key strengths within our curriculum and approach to qualifications. They will make some important and much needed improvements, as we have heard today, in relation to the rebalancing of qualifications requirements, recognising the changes in our education system, particularly post-pandemic, but also the way in which we need to support our young people and take recognition of their broader achievements too.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes topical questions.